Great, hi everybody. We want to give some time for people to trickle in, but welcome back to Design at Large. I'm really excited this week to welcome Professor Stacy Branham from UC Irvine. Stacy's an assistant professor of informatics there and did her PhD in human-centered computing at Virginia Tech. And one of the things, I actually met Stacy at a computer interaction conference when she was giving a presentation about the work that she did to support therapeutic relationships among caregivers, medical professionals, and people with disabilities. And she was framing her work in terms of interdependence, the interdependence among these people, not just the empowerment of an individual, but actually the things that we're trying to build for are the technology to support social relationships. And we need to understand the qualities of those social relationships our technologies create. So as a communication person, I was really excited about this and the ways that Stacy really reads in disability justice and feminist studies, brings that into the design of technologies, and then by deploying those technologies in real world settings, then brings new understandings of how we can understand also disability and gender and work through these experiments and other ways of being in the world. So with that, I want us to welcome Stacy Branham and thank her for coming to visit us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. What a generous introduction. It is a true pleasure to be down here, not just because I got to ride on a train next to the ocean with ample legroom this morning, but it really is a pleasure. And today I'm going to share with you some tidbits of my recent work over the past 3 years to try to synthesize a new argument. I'm test driving it with you, so I highly encourage you to keep your critical thinking hats on and to please engage me in conversation. Have questions ready. Feel free to interrupt as well. I like to have a dialogic exchange. The title of my talk is Marginalized People Are Expert, Not Other, in AI Design. All right. To start off, how many of you have ever thought about how a blind person uses a smartphone? Raise your hand, please. Oh, that is impressive. We probably have about 20 people with their hands up. I asked that same question to about 300 undergraduate computer science majors, and about the same number of hands went up. And the thing that's shocking to me is that if you asked me that question in 2014, I would have said, nope. And I had not only a bachelor's degree in computer science, but a PhD with a concentration in human-computer interaction. So I had a license to build technologies and to critically evaluate how they work for people. And I had never thought about how a person, not just a person with a visual impairment, but a person with a disability would use these things. And that's a problem, right? That's a big problem if you care about inclusive excellence and diversity. It's a problem if you care about enjoying your retirement, because by the time that we reach the age of 65, about half of us will have some disability. And it's a problem if you care about good design, because research time and again shows that when you design for people from diverse backgrounds and diverse abilities, that you end up with something that's better for everyone. All right. So anyway, in 2014, when I started my postdoc with Sean Kane, it just solidified my identity as a critical computer scientist. What I mean by that is I'm still someone who's interested in designing and building things, but I do so critically. I do so with a care to try to understand what it reveals about our cultural values and what the purpose of these devices really is, and how we can do it in a way that's meaningful and inclusive, all right? So I critique design builds assistive technologies for marginalized people, and an example of a project that I recently concluded back in 2017, it was a collaboration with Amy Hurst. I was a co-PI on a 1.5-year grant with Toyota for a couple $100,000, and we helped them to design this wearable device called Blade, Blind Aid. It had cameras on it. It had vibration motors for tactile feedback. It spoke to you and allowed you to speak to it. And the idea here was that this device could help identify visual features within large indoor spaces like this. There's an exit sign at 1 p.m. right? There's a set of stairs or a ramp over at 9 p.m. And so this is one of the projects where we started to explore, at least my role in the project was trying to understand how this device might interact with social context. Not just me as an individual trying to navigate, but what do other people around me, how do they interact with me, and how does that change how I use or don't use this technology? Another example of a project that I worked on recently that I'll be drawing from in this talk is a grant that I'm currently PI of. It's funded by TRX Systems. It's a small company in Maryland. And what they do is they develop devices and platforms that enable you to navigate turn by turn inside buildings. Because we know that GPS doesn't really work well in buildings, so they use a number of other tactics to figure out where you are, on what floor, and how to get from here to the bathroom, or from here to the elevator, right? And one of the questions that I'm focusing on with this work is, well, as we start to look beyond just efficient routes, what's the shortest way to get from here to there, what sorts of features should we care about in our route? Do we care about avoiding stairs, avoiding ramps that are non-ADA compliant and are too steep, avoiding crowds, etc. Okay, and how people with various disabilities, and maybe even multiple disabilities, might think variously about how they prefer to navigate. Okay, and then the final thing that I think is really important to the way that I do work and my identity as a researcher is that I don't just design for marginalized people, I design with them. So here are a few pictures that I scrounged up that fit across the bottom of people I've worked with in the past about year. And we have represented here multiple women in computing, people of color, people who are first-generation college students, 2 people who are blind, a person who's a wheelchair user, LGBTQ representation, etc. Because I really believe that when we include people and actually put them in positions of power and decision-making and design, that we're going to end up with something better than if it's just the same old academic players. All right. So here's what I'm going to try to convince you in the next 40-ish minutes, okay? First, I think a relatively safe claim. Artificial intelligence, as a representative of various, just one instance of various types of technologies, AI systems harm marginalized communities. The second thing I'm going to try to convince you is that disabled people and people who are transgender are others, not just in artificial intelligence, but also in the field of HCI, human-computer interaction, of which I feel like I'm a part, okay? So I think the reason that AIs are harming marginalized communities is in part because we still other them. And finally, and this is where I'm going to need your help. It's a new argument I'm trying on you. I think that there's one possible way out of this is to try to reframe people from marginalized backgrounds as experts instead of different others. All right, let's get started. So I'm sure some of you have seen these books on the bookshelf, Weapons of Mass Destruction, Algorithms of Oppression. We're starting to have a popular culture conversation around how artificial intelligence and how algorithms are changing the ways that we relate, right? And how they might be doing harm. And if we look in the newspaper, I'm sure you've started to see how various marginalized communities have been negatively affected by these algorithms. So as an example, people who are African Americans being tagged by Google's algorithm as gorillas. When you go and you type in a search query, having the query being completed in ways that reify stereotypes. For example, women shouldn't, and then the suggestion is have rights, vote, work. And then along the ability axis, so I have race, a gender, ability. An example from a comedian who was trying to dictate a calendar event through Siri, and he said, call radio 2. But because he has a speech impediment, it actually typed in call Wadey 2, W-A-D-E-Y. And partly in jest, but partly from real experience, he says, that's just hurtful. It's mocking me, right? So I would classify these under microaggressions, right? The sort of small social incidents where we recognize that racial and gender and various other sorts of bias are being used against us. And so, of course, I believe in the kind of death by 1,000 cuts model where these build and build, but I also want to point to some more immediately extreme examples to show that this is really critical. So, for example, Facebook was caught with an advertiser interface where people could place ads for housing and exclude people based upon their gender, race, and various other identities, right? We don't have any evidence that they were actually used, but we know about redlining, right? We've been there. Gender. So Amazon tried to come up with an AI that could select potential employees, and essentially it trained itself to devalue women's resumes. I mean, that's not surprising. For decades, we have studies that demonstrate that this actually happens. You just change the name on the top of the resume, and guess who gets more callbacks? Yeah?
Can I ask you
Please.
to actually check in and see, like, how many people do know what redlining is? Because it might bear 2 to 3 sentences.
Oh, so essentially,
Why are you asking? I'm curious.
oh, how many of you know what redlining is? Ooh, does anyone want to venture? Okay, does anyone want to venture an explanation? Oh, okay, I'll be brave. So, yes, go ahead, yes.
It's probably going to be a very blasé, but it's the idea that historically there have been neighborhoods that have, that policies have existed that place people of color in neighborhoods that don't have enough access to the same resources as others. And make those neighborhoods like, and because of socioeconomic reasons, and basically limit their possibilities of getting ever out of that neighborhood.
Absolutely, that was a very good explanation. And there were proactive measures taken to deny access to different communities based upon race. And so essentially lines were drawn in the sand between where one can live and not live based upon their race. Ability. So there's an example from Idaho where people with learning disabilities were realizing that their Medicaid costs were going up by 20 to 30%. And when they started doing digging, it was because of an algorithm, an AI algorithm, that was based on bad data, and it had a bad model, that's what a judge said, in fancier words, and was essentially discriminating against these people for their disability status. All right? So in the field of human-computer interaction, as academics, we have been starting to try to articulate some of these challenges and some of these biases and make sense of them. So for example, I know some work from Jen Rode and her collaborators, does technology have race? Actually introduced that example about gorillas that I cited earlier. We've been starting to talk about how gender is represented and not in various social media platforms. And in my field of assistive technology, people like Patrick Carrington have been starting to think about, well, if I have an activity tracker, how do I use that if I have a wheelchair? I don't count steps, I don't take steps. People like Jeff Bigham have been thinking about, well, how do deaf people use speech input devices? How will it recognize what they're saying, all right? And then I have across the bottom a note to Ari Schlesinger's recent work on intersectional HCI, essentially trying to draw attention to the fact that, you know what, it's different for you if you occupy multiple marginalized identities at the same time. Okay? You can be a black man, you can be a white woman, but being a black woman is something wholly unique, and it can render you invisible or doubly taxed. So this is great, horrible, right? It's horrible because this is really problematic for social justice, but it's great that we're starting to actually identify it and try to grapple with it as a field. And I wanted to, just in the next several slides, share with you some of my recent study findings. I'm not going to tell you the whole story of each study, but just some snippets of findings from various papers my lab's been producing that help to uncover some of the harms that I'm seeing from AI systems and prospective AI systems. And I decided to organize this by the kind of stages in the artificial intelligence development process. So you might start with problem scoping and framing. Then you might figure out, where am I going to get my data from so that I can create a learning model, okay? And then there's like a black box of activity that my research hasn't really tapped into, and I hope that people are starting to work on this. To understand like the materiality of the actual algorithms and how it might be discriminating against marginalized people. But I jumped down to deployment. What happens once you create the AI and you release it into the world? How does it impact people from these various identities? So the first example comes from a project that is the brainchild of my senior PhD student, Ali Abdurrahmani. Ali is a white cane user, he's blind legally, and he is fascinated by the idea that voice assistants or conversational agents like Siri, Alexa, Cortana, that these devices might transform the way that he interacts with applications. And so there are two parallel projects that we're running. One by a master's student, his name is Rashin. And so Rashin has been looking at the design guidelines that are public-facing from each of these companies and trying to figure out, what are the common shared core values and recommendations given by these companies? I mean, frankly, we don't, as a field, we're not leading this. We don't have a significant amount of design recommendations from within the academic HCI field about how to do this. So companies are kind of spinning them off on their own. And then the second project that Ali's been running, he just published a paper at Assets this year, last year, is interviewing blind individuals about how they use these devices and how they wish they could use them when they're not quite working out, all right? And the thing that's interesting to me is that the kind of conceptual model that designers have for how these devices ought to work has some serious chasms with how the mental model is for the people who have visual impairments and how they want to use these devices. And I'm going to try to demonstrate that by showing you a video of how Ali uses two different methods to figure out the weather today. The first one is he asks Siri, tell me the weather today, and you'll hear the reaction. The second one is he uses his phone. And by the way, smartphones, blind people, there's something called VoiceOver on Apple, where you can use gestures and swipes and taps, and then the phone will speak to you. So you can hear what's visually presented on the screen. He's going to use VoiceOver to ask for the weather. And I want you to think about the differences between those two. So here we go.
Hey Siri, how is the weather today?
It's currently clear and 53 degrees in Catonsville. Expect partly cloudy skies starting in the evening. Temperatures are heading down from 55 degrees this afternoon to 50 tonight.
Weather active. Actions available. Weather active. Weather. Catonsville. Sunny. 53 degrees. Monday. Mostly clear. High 55. Low 45.
Oop, I think the audio cut off at the last part, but you get the gist, right? Yeah. Did I push my? Okay. So what did you notice between those two different styles of interaction? Yeah.
And the second one, I kind of knew, he had memorized the path that he had to take, so he doesn't really want to hear the voiceover. It's like, and on the first one, I mean, it's kind of annoying to listen to this long, drawn-out explanation. So in that way, they're kind of the same.
Absolutely. So the first one is this kind of chit-chat or kind of leisurely talking about the weather. And the second one is down to business. I have memorized how to get to exactly the data I want, and I can do it extremely efficiently. And I'm going to have a robot voice basically talk to me to tell me the weather. And so we noticed that many blind people, they want to use these devices as if they're like computers doing productivity tasks for them, okay? But the expected model from the people who are designing these systems is that these should be like human-to-human, naturalistic conversations, okay? And so these models are incommensurate. You know, people with disabilities want to reduce verbosity. They want to increase speed. They want to have really robust error correction because I want to write a text message that's like 3 paragraphs long. That's effective communication for me. I want to do word processing with my voice, right? Those are tasks that we currently don't think that sighted people want to do, although I think that in the future we will start to think about doing that. So that's my story, is that from this first example, the designers have a model for how this AI ought to work, and people who have visual impairments have a different model. Okay. Second example in the problem scoping stage. So I told you about this Project Blade. It's a wearable device. It's got cameras. It's using computer vision to recognize exit signs. We wondered, do people who are blind want to notice other things in the environment? It was shocking. No one had really asked this question before in our field. And when we started talking to them about other things in the environment, like people, they wouldn't stop talking because they cared a lot about what other people were doing around them when they were walking down the street. And one of the key things was that they were worried about safety. Like, is that person who's telling me they're a police officer actually a police officer? Another thing that came up is, I'm a woman, I'm blind, it's late, I hear some people walking towards me, they're not talking, I don't know if they're looking at me, if they're maybe going to attack me. Are they big? Are they men? One of the people on my research team said, if we follow the kind of solutionist path of a computer scientist, maybe we would make an algorithm that would detect the gender of people who were oncoming. But that student was like, I don't know if that's going to work very well for transgender people, and I want to explore that. How would that technology impact the trans community? And so we wrote a couple of papers about this. And one of the key things that came up is that many trans people, well, first of all, automatic gender recognition algorithms are already in use, which honestly, I didn't know that. But if you walk down the street, there are actually some ads that try to target you based on your face. I mean, and on websites, if you upload your pictures, they're trying to figure out what's your gender so that we can target advertisements to you. Law enforcement's interested in this. Maybe I can find a criminal. In any event, the people who we talked to who are transgender were concerned because for many of them, they thought, gender's non-binary. Why are you trying to sort me into male-female? Male-female other is even worse. Gender's dynamic from day to day, moment to moment. It's not some fixed category. And by the way, it's private. You cannot tell my gender by just looking at my chest shape, by looking at my hair, or my face structure, or my clothes. Stop it. And by the way, it's, as one participant said, bioessentialist for them to think that they could gender me based upon a picture of me. All right? So again, we see the model of the programmers, the AI experts, and transgender people not being commensurate. Yes?
What does bioessentialist mean?
It's essentially boiling down your gender to biological facts like your genetics or something like this, or your sexual parts. Yes? Ish? Okay. So here's my third example, and it comes from the data sourcing phase. So we've got the problem scoping phase. Now we're on to collecting data so that we can train our AI. And there have been incidents where, for example, researchers will go and scrape data from YouTube trying to identify people, from people who have gone through the transition process so that they can train their AI to recognize somebody who's transitioned. And then made that data available for other people to access. And for our for our transgender participants, this was terrifying. It was terrifying to think that other people might be trying to identify me as someone who's trans and then make that public. someone said, honestly, it looks like, well, first of all, one of our participants found their name on one such list. And then they said, it looks like it's just something used for doxing. It was really scary. And then other people thinking forward to, like, well, how might this data be used against me? I could see in North Carolina, for example, where there's ongoing debates about bathroom access, being denied entry into a bathroom or being put in a precarious situation where I might be targeted by other people. All right, so this is dangerous. A fourth example, in the deployment phase. Now that we've got an AI, we're ready to deploy it in a system. And I'm going to run back to the blind study, to the blind aid set of studies. And the idea here is that AIs are not perfect, right? If you get a 95% accurate system, then computer science are like, woohoo, right? But you know, when you have a facial recognition or computer vision application, things like lighting really matter. Things like occlusions, maybe someone's shoulder's in the way of my camera so I can't see that thing, or angles, or just, you know, plain mismatches. And so the concern that participants had was, well, what happens when this makes a mistake and other people think that it was my fault and like it reifies their vision of me as being incapable or less than? You know, I would be a little bit frazzled if this device told me there was a door over there and I started feeling for the door. It would draw attention to myself. And I'm concerned that someone else might grab my arm. Don't ever grab a blind person's arm without first asking their permission. Same rule as for a sighted person, right? But it happens all the time because sighted people think that they're helping the blind person. It's actually just invading someone's personal space and terrifying them, right? So in any event, the device errors caused consternation. The idea of having device errors caused consternation for our blind participants because of the social situations that could arise from that. And then the final example I have for you about deployment and little tidbits gathered from my studies is this idea about potentially being outed by the technology. So for example, this is an example one of our participants gave. I'm navigating a website, someone else is looking over my shoulder, and I'm getting ads targeted at me related to like hormone replacement therapy, right? I don't want that person to know about my gender. Like, that's none of their business. And it's not just none of their business, but people were concerned that they might get kicked out of the house. They might have trouble getting a job. They might be harassed by coworkers. They might be fired from their job. They might have their home vandalized. They might be physically or sexually assaulted. So the stakes are really high. And we need to be careful that these devices are not disclosing information about people that they're not authorized to disclose. One of the quotes from our participants was, there are people online who want to rape or beat up or kill people who are queer. And so if they knew where I lived or they found me on the street at night, they might try that. I mean, this was from a black trans male to female person. And so the precarity was, of their situation was palpable. And they knew people who had been murdered. So we have to be really, really careful about this. So anyway, I guess my conclusion to this part of the talk is that yes, AI can harm people from marginalized identities, and oftentimes I think that arises because we don't include those groups in our initial thinking about these products, right? And if you want to know more about the sorts of harms these can perpetuate, and not just pertaining to AI, because that's not necessarily my focus of my work, then please check out some of the papers we've recently published in the last couple years. So what this brings me to is like, okay, AI's got some stuff they're working through. Can we help them? From our field, HCI, I mean, we've been working for decades in this field trying to understand people's needs and translate them into sensible technologies. Are we equipped to help? And I actually think that we still have some real challenges because I think our methods and our tools other people with disabilities and they other trans people. So I want to ask you to imagine this scenario. A father and a son are in a horrible car crash that kills the dad. The son is rushed to the hospital. Just as he's about to go under the knife, the surgeon says, "I can't operate. That boy's my son." How many of you imagined that the surgeon was a gay dad? Well, 85% of the people who responded to a survey about this, there was a study done, actually made that assumption, over the assumption that it was a female surgeon, a mother. Yes, and that, I think, is the power of othering, of assuming that the default for a particular identity is, that there is a particular default for an identity, right? Like, so for example, for decades when I would Google, not decades, but for like the last decade when I would Google something like human anatomy, or even if you open a book, a textbook for human anatomy, you're gonna see a man, a very fit man, right? And so that is the power of the default and the other. You're not gonna see a wheelchair user in that anatomy book, right? Unless it's like abnormal anatomy or something. And that's problematic, right? So that's what I mean by othering, by having an other. And you know, trans and disabled people, they're other. They're considered abnormal, they're considered queer, they're considered non-human, really, and monsters. There's so many pieces of literature that go to back up these associations that we make. And the challenge is that being other is dangerous. Okay, so for disability, for example, the people with disabilities are 2.5 times more likely to be victims of a violent crime. And people who are transgender, there was the largest recent survey of trans people in America, 54% reported being victims of intimate partner violence, 47% victims of sexual assault, 46% victims of verbal harassment, right? It's dangerous. And so looking to the field of HCI, there are many different fronts I could speak to. Like, what about representation amongst faculty members in the field or practitioners? But I want to focus in on some methods, and I'm broadly going to clump them into 2 groups, okay? I'm going to call them traditional user-centered design methods, and later I'm going to focus on inclusive design methods. So for the moment, think about things like contextual inquiry, scenario-based design, value-centered design, participatory design, empathic design, various user-centered design methods that are the canon of our field. As Kristen Shinohara recently said in her paper, the challenge is that a user-centered approach only centers disabled people in the process if the designers desire accessible outcomes. Non-disabled users are the de facto target audience. And this is the thing. When we set out to design in user-centered design, we say, well, who's our target user? The target user is human, not non-human. It is the default, it's not the other, right? That's a small community. It's only, 1% of the population. We won't be able to sell any devices that way. Why would we look at them first? They're the people we'll look to next. And you see this time and again. When I did studies in the homes of blind people, they would look around the kitchen and they'd be like, look at all the flat screens. Everything's flat. It used to be that things had buttons that I could feel and I could memorize how to use them, but now it's just all flat. It's like we moved backwards. This wasn't an innovation that made my life better. It actually disrupted things, and that happens over and over and over again for people who are other, because they're the last group to be attended to, and workarounds have to be made instead of preparation. And one thing I just want to emphasize here is that the reality is these groups aren't that small, right? Even if we're looking at transgender people and they're 0.6%, which is the estimation now of the US population, that's millions of people. And people with impairment, people with disabilities, that's about 1 in 10 people, right? That's more than the number of people with breast cancer. That's more than the number of people living in poverty. It's a large group of people. All right? So I'm not sure that those arguments really hold up. Yeah. Okay, moving on to inclusive design methods. Okay, we have the traditional methods. In reaction to that, we've tried to develop a number of methods that specifically try to include people who are other, like universal usability, ability-based design, inclusive design, user-sensitive inclusive design, design for user empowerment. But Kristen Shunahara is keen, and she points out, you know, there's concern though, because emphasizing disability, or I'm using that to be a stand-in for like otherness, may lead the designs only for disabled users, not necessarily increasing mainstream accessibility. And this is a big problem, right? When only a smaller population is using a device, it's specialized, it costs a lot more money because you don't get the economies of scale of a mainstream solution, right? Plus, it's othering to have a weird device. Like, I'll be a little critical of our Blade device. If only blind people are using that, then it's kind of weird. I don't feel like I fit in. People are gonna look at me and be like, what the heck is that, right? So in any event, I don't think these work either. And in my experience, people fall into these two camps, and a smaller number fall into the inclusive design camp, and many people just simply don't identify as using these practices, or they don't find it practical. I asked my husband, who's a UX designer in industry, yesterday, I'm like, so have you ever recruited people with disabilities into your user studies? And he goes, I've tried to make that argument over and over again. Always get shot down. I'm just fighting to get time to do user studies at all. So pragmatically, I think these are nice. I think they happen in academia by some academicians, but it doesn't actually trickle down into real practice. All right. So are you with me? I said, AI harms marginalized communities. I said, disabled and trans people are others, even in HCI, and so I'm worried that maybe we can't help the AI people fix their stuff. We got to fix our stuff first. And now I'm going to tease through this idea of maybe one possible way out. What if we tried to see the expertise in those marginalized communities? Maybe we can include them in design earlier. So here's a claim. Some blind screen reader users, meaning people who are blind who listen to their computer talk to them and interact with the keyboard to figure out what's visually happening on the computer and to click things, type in things. Some screen reader users who are blind are essentially expert voice user interface users. That's a mouthful. But what I mean is they spend hours upon hours a day taking visual information and figuring out how to verbalize it. And so why wouldn't we include them from the get-go in designing systems like conversational agents that are non-visual? Ali, my PhD student, says it's like the most natural medium that I have. One of the most fundamental skills I have is language. Why wouldn't I be a good person to help design those systems and test them? All right? A second claim, maybe to help us understand how this might translate to the transgender community, we could maybe argue that some transgender people are experts in gender, right? Because they have this deep embodied experience of their own gender roles, and they've had to puzzle through them because they don't potentially fit in with the standard gender roles that were assigned to them or expected of them. And oftentimes, the people we interviewed, they would seek out formal gender and queer studies knowledge. Maybe they'd even specialize in that in school or participate in online communities trying to tease out what is gender really. So why aren't we consulting with them when we're developing apps that are trying to represent gender? Really briefly, I wanted to share how I'm implementing this sort of idea of expert marginalities in my laboratory. So, for example, Ali is my blind PhD student. He's leading this project. He came up with the entire idea of focusing on voice interfaces and trying to figure out how to make them work better for people who are blind. So he runs studies with other expert blind co-designers. He's leading a team of sighted developers to extend Google Assistant to incorporate some new features that he thinks would work better. And then he's planning to run some studies where he tries to see if the features he developed for blind people actually have universal usability qualities, meaning that other people who don't have disabilities can find utility in those same tools. And I'm really excited to say that Toyota's just funded 2 more years, not 2 more years, this is a new project, but 2 years of this project that should take him to the end of his PhD. So in sum, I think that when we story people from marginalized identities as experts, we get a few things. We consult experts first. We pay experts for their expertise. And experts help us. But others are consulted last, if at all. We don't pay others, and we help others. You see how it restories that? I think that's important. So I'm coming close to the end, maybe 5 more minutes here. But I wanted to just point out that this idea of universal usability, which I think is a very powerful idea. The idea that if we design for diverse users, that almost everyone can participate, almost everyone can use that technology. But what's interesting to me is that when you read textbooks about universal usability, they say, here's how you do it. Get a diverse set of target users. That's about it. I think that basically collapses down into the traditional design methods where you say, get some target users, right? And the thing is that the canonical example of universal usability is this thing. Have you guys seen this before? What's this thing? What's this thing made of concrete in the picture? It's a curb cut, thank you. Curb cuts are amazing because not only can wheelchairs use them, but people using scooters, people on bicycles, people with baby carriages, people on skateboards, people with rollerboards, people with dollies can use this. My daughter, who's 3 years old and can't really lift her feet up very well and trips over everything, she can get up there. It's fantastic. You know why we have it? It's not because HCI people got together and said, oh, let's make curb cuts, it'll be universally usable. It's because people with disabilities put their bodies on the line and they advocated for and got the ADA legislation passed that said you must do it, and a person who is a wheelchair user actually was an architect and invented it. Please help.
Well, I also heard that in Berkeley, California, activists destroyed public property to make the curb cuts well before the ADA. So,
oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so maybe they would have been arrested in that day.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's dangerous, all right? People with disabilities continue to put their lives on the line for us, like the recent ADAPT die-ins that they were doing to try to save Medicaid. So in any event, I think that we need to realize the essential initial roles that people with disabilities are playing in creating these universally usable things, and not just assume that it's something we can roll into a design process that's run by people like me. I identify as having an invisible disability, but mostly run by people who don't identify as disabled, right? So that's my idea. That's one way out. I think there are many ways out. And so to wrap up, I simply wanted to ask, have you ever thought about how a blind person uses a smartphone? Everyone, raise your hand now. That's what I did. We spent 50 minutes, but we got there. And I think that's really important. That was the beginning for me, is to start thinking about this. And my great hope is that as you go forth in your various career paths as researchers and designers, as cognitive scientists who don't know exactly what they're going to do in 3 months when they graduate, but that you will start to think, how are others, experts, thinking about this and using this? How can I include them in the decision-making room? And are there new ways that we can create methods and tools and ways of thinking about design that are going to make sure that universal access is a reality, okay? With that, I want to thank you. You've been a lovely audience. I also want to thank my collaborators. Here are just a few of their pictures. I know I'm missing some. I want to thank our funders, and I'd be really delighted to take questions. Thank you.